My name's Kathy, I'm the festival manager, and I would like to give you a very warm welcome to this evening's event, which is Why Your Body Clock is Good for Your Health with David Ray. Well, we have over 100 events in the festival. One that may be of interest to you actually is a play that we've commissioned that very much connects with tonight's topic of circadian rhythms and body clocks and sleep and sleeplessness. It's called Small Hours, and if you go onto our website, which is if-oxford.com, and search in the search function in the events for Small Hours, hopefully in just a little while you'll be able to see the trailer for this new play that we've commissioned. So I'm now going to hand you over actually to Roy Probert from the National Institute for Health Research, who are bringing this particular event to you. Roy can tell you a little bit more about what the Institute does, and then he will pass over to David for tonight's lecture. Over to you, Roy.
Thank you, Kathy, and thanks to the festival organisers. I'd like to welcome you all to this talk on behalf of the National Institute of Health Research, the NIHR. My name's Roy Probert, and I'm the Communications Manager for the NIHR Oxford Biomedical Research Centre. This talk this evening is part of a series of talks called Health Research and You, and we've got upcoming talks on topics like childhood anxiety, how technology has revolutionised diabetes treatments, and endometriosis. If you're interested in any of those, look on the festival website and please register. For those of you who don't know, the NIHR is the UK's biggest funder of health and care research. It was established in 2006 by the Department of Health to improve health and wealth of the nation by supporting the translation of basic science into clinical benefits for NHS patients. That means we fund groundbreaking research by people like Professor David Ray. David is Professor of Endocrinology at the University of Oxford's Radcliffe Department of Medicine, and his research focuses on the effects of circadian rhythms on our metabolism and immune system. And I'm going to hand over now to David so he can explain to us why your body clock is important for your health.
It's a great honour to be able to talk with you today, and I'm going to run through some of our recent research which relates to how circadian rhythms and body clocks impact on immunity, inflammation, and on energy metabolism. So, as mentioned, I'm very grateful to the NIHR for funding and support. So, here we go. This is me thinking deeply. This is middle of the afternoon. I don't know how many of you also struggle to focus around about 3 o'clock after having lunch. I'd really like to be fully alert and fully functional. But why is it that we're facing an epidemic of exhaustion across all developed countries? And I would put it to you that this relates to our desire to live against our body clocks. So, sleep. Why should we take any interest in sleep? It's not a very exciting topic, perhaps. There's some rather startling observations about how we now sleep in comparison to how we used to. For example, 30% of all Americans now sleep for less than 6 hours per 24-hour period. And it goes up to about 24% if you include shift workers. Whereas only 50 years ago, less than 3% of Americans slept so little. We strikingly sleep on different schedules at the weekends than we do during the week, which causes something called social jet lag, which contributes to that awful feeling on Monday morning when the alarm goes off and you really struggle to get going. All this is happening at the time when we're lighting up our lives more and more. And the brighter we make our nights, the less we sleep. In the USA, it's been estimated that between 50 and 70 million people suffer adverse health consequences from sleep disorders and from a lack of sleep. And prominent among these are conditions such as obesity, which, as I'm sure you're aware, we're now running at epidemic levels. So it's not just long-term consequences that we should be concerned about. Here are 4 major disasters: an American Airlines crash, Exxon Valdez, a major tanker spill, 3 Mile Island, a nuclear disaster, and of course the mother of all industrial accidents, Chernobyl. All these disasters had in common that mistakes were made by workers who had been engaged in night shift work. So if you estimate the total cost in terms of lives lost, human suffering, and financial impact, night shifts and sleep disruption should be high on our list of concerns. So why is that? Well, being tired, being fatigued is like being drunk, and none of us particularly want to have a drunk airline pilot. This is a study looking at wakefulness, and after 18 hours of wakefulness here, human performance was equivalent to having a blood alcohol concentration of 0.1%. So to put that in context, in a blood alcohol concentration of 0.08%, that is less than this, counts as legally intoxicated in the USA. And this equates to being very impaired. So slow reactions, lots of mistakes. So if sleep is so important, why don't we just get some more of it? That sounds fairly straightforward. Although we spend 1/3 of our lives asleep, we still understand relatively little about why we need to sleep and also what kind of controls lead to us sleeping. This is a current model of the drives to sleep. This process C, this is a daily oscillation. This is your circadian drive to sleep. This is your body clock, either telling you to wake up when it goes up or telling you to sleep when it goes down. The other major drive is sleep deprivation. So here, when you wake up at 7 a.m., the longer you're awake, the more the sleep pressure builds up in your brain and makes it more and more likely that you'll drop off to sleep. So during the day, you're getting more and more sleep pressure, but your circadian clock, your body clock, is telling you to be awake. As you move into the evening, your body clock is telling you now's a good time to sleep, and you're losing this wakefulness drive. At the same time, you're getting more and more sleepy, and eventually get to the point where you go to sleep, and here you relieve the sleep pressure, ready to start a new day. If you stay awake, then you have this condition of sleep deprivation. And the problem now is that if you try and sleep at this point, look, your body clock is telling you it's time to wake up. So if you try to sleep now, you won't sleep for as long and the quality of the sleep will be less. So if this body clock is so important, how do we reset it? Well, our body's master clock lies in our brains and it's reset by light. So light comes in through the eye, and we are very familiar with the use of the eyes to see things, to form images. Well, in addition to that, they supply light information to our central clock here in the brain, which here, as you can see, it's a tiny structure in the brain, but you can see if you look at electrical firing rate in the day, it's more active than during the night. And if you watch through a series of day, night, day, night, day, night, this clock keeps ticking. So that's fine. We've got lights in our houses, so we should be able to just follow the light in the house, right? There are 2 problems with that. First of all, we've adapted to respond to sunlight, and sunlight outside, even on a dim day, is about 1,000-fold brighter than the light inside a house. We've just not adapted to living with dim light. Secondly, not all light is equal. So the light that our brains look for to tell us about the time of day is in this spectrum, the sort of blue light, the high energy light. And these are examples of 3 different ways of lighting your house: incandescent lights, fluorescent tubes, and light emitting diodes. As you can see, they all look white to our eye, but the spectrum of different wavelengths is very different. And interestingly, if you look at incandescent or fluorescent light, the amount of the blue light that's so important for resetting our clock is relatively low, but you can dial up a strong blue light signal with particular types of LEDs, which may be much more effective at entraining our brain clocks. So that's introduced the brain clock here. And that allows us to remain in synchrony with our external light-dark environment. And I've also talked to you about the central clock in the brain and the suprachiasmatic nucleus. A striking recent discovery is that in addition to this clock, every cell in the body has its own internal timing mechanism or clock. And these all tick perfectly in synchrony. So what's happening is that the central clock, which is the only bit that can see whether it's day or night, sends out signals to these peripheral clocks to keep them all ticking in time. And these clocks ticking away drive many different body functions, including sleep-wake, which we talked about before, but many other functions as well. So that if you look at a 24-hour clock around here, you can see that different physical performance characteristics or different endocrine parameters, they all vary and peak at different clock phases, different times as we go around the clock. I've been talking a bit about synchrony, and with the help of Daniel here, I'll try and introduce what I mean. So the clocks in each of our cells are rather like each of these metronomes. The risk is, of course, that they all can start to tick out of time. However, in our bodies, they're connected, so that if you connect these metronomes in this way by letting them balance on rolling cans, you can see that the oscillators now start to tick in time. It's this synchronization process that's so important for keeping us healthy, both internally, and also the synchronization of our internal clock with the external light-dark environment that's so important for health. So the most obvious and prevalent example of challenging our body clock is trying to work on shifts. So what do we know about shift work? Is it a good idea? Well, it may be unavoidable, but it certainly carries a risk to our health. This is just a BBC report from a few years ago, reporting higher rates of obesity and ill health in shift workers. So, you know, sure, we need to work on shift. We need to have some people to keep the hospitals open at night, for example, but we shouldn't kid ourselves that this is a risk-free activity. And it turns out we're not all created equally. So along the bottom here, this Hornostberg score gives a measure for whether you're an evening person, someone who likes to get up late, go to bed late, or a morning person, someone who likes to get up early and go to bed early. And you can see that evening people here adjust to night shift work much more rapidly. So this is the rate of change of their central clock to entrain with night shift work. So there's at least something we can do to help people prepare for night shift work. We can work out which people are going to be able to adapt better. And it's true that the Health and Safety Executive, which exists to try and promote health and safety in the workplace, is concerned about shift workers, and they publish advice. And so this is a good port of call if you are a shift worker and if you're concerned about your health. Striking their number one risk is getting to and from work, the risk of having a car accident when driving tired. So when I've been talking about clocks in every cell in the body, and I've been giving you an example of a metronome, what do I actually mean by a clock operating in a cell? Well, rather like a metronome, this is the molecular clock machinery, and it works as a feedback loop. So you have proteins here at the center, 2 proteins at the center, which switch on genes, which give rise to synthesis of proteins, which build up and then feed back. So in fact, for the core molecular clock, there are 2 feedback loops. And each of these loops is rather like the movement of the arm in the metronome, accelerating in one direction and then accelerating in the other direction. I'm going to talk a bit about two of these components later on, BMAL1 and reverb, and I'll introduce those as we come to it. So this concern about misalignment between our internal clock and the external light-dark environment is a very recent development. This is a rather beautiful diagram which shows individual cities across the continental USA and their own individual time zones. So I know it's relatively small, but each city had its own individual bespoke time zone, which reflected the sun's zenith in that city. And these differed by relatively small margins, 20 minutes, half an hour, and so on. And of course, until the arrival of the train, that was absolutely fine, but it makes designing a train timetable very difficult, and so time zones were imposed. Even in the UK, until the Great Western Railway reached Bristol, Bristol had its own time zone, as an example. So I've been talking a little bit about sleep, and perhaps people who need sleep, need a lot of sleep, might be regarded as lazy or not sufficiently motivated. We're all aware, for example, that Margaret Thatcher famously was a very short sleeper. However, I would perhaps suggest that our sleep need is something very fundamental that's actually hardwired into our DNA. This is a scan across all the human chromosomes, and what we're looking for here are naturally occurring genetic variants that predict sleep duration. And you can see that anything over this dotted red line is a highly significant association. So there are actually well over 100, and they're all listed here, genes in the human genome where we know there are naturally occurring variations that impact on our sleep duration. So sleep is very important, and our need for sleep is genetically encoded. So my background's in medicine, so is this just a curiosity, or is it actually important for how we practice medicine? Well, most human diseases have got a circadian element to them. This is an example from rheumatoid arthritis, a chronic inflammatory disease affecting the joints. This is the time of day along the bottom, and this is symptom severity, as you can see, oscillating quite markedly during the day. And this is looking at the reason for that joint stiffness and inflammation, the activity of the immune system here, showing again the red line, what a marked variation there is during the passage of time. This is some work we did where we got some human circulating immune cells, and we purified macrophages, and we cultured them in a dish. So they're growing in plastic, they can't see the time on the clock on the wall, and they can't see light. But when we synchronize them in a dish, you can see that their response to activation varies with time. So they've got a memory that their clocks continue to work even when they're cultured in plastic. We were the first people to identify small drug-like molecules that were capable of regulating the clock, and we were able to show that these molecules were able to inhibit the expression of interleukin-6, an inflammatory mediator, the same inflammatory mediator that I showed you in the previous slide that drives the expression of rheumatoid arthritis by time of day. There's a lot of concern at the moment about inflammation in the lung, because that's the primary site of entry of the COVID virus. The lung is a highly circadian organ. This is an example. You can see the circadian oscillation here in epithelial cells, which line the airway, and here in macrophages. These are the professional immune cells that protect the lung. And you can see a key protein here, reverb, that I mentioned earlier. This is its abundance. You see it's not there at the start of the day. It's very abundant in the middle part of the day, and it completely disappears later on, indicating what a striking effect this circadian system is having. So we wanted to know whether this immune system in the lung also varied according to the time of day. This is looking at infection studies using pneumococcus, which is a cause of a highly prevalent bacterial pneumonia. So when infection takes place during the day in the open circles or during the night, after 24 hours, there's no particular difference in either bacteria in the lung or the extension of the bacterial infection to the bloodstream, the septicemia. However, by 48 hours, you can see that the time of day at which the bacterial infection is encountered is starting to make a big difference. So that infection during the night results in far less bacteria and far less bacteria in the bloodstream. So indicating that the clock, our body clock, is regulating our defense systems in the lung. We felt it was probably due to something happening in the macrophage, the cell I introduced you to earlier. So what we did was look at macrophages, either in a dish or here in vivo, and we were able to see how well they were able to eat up bacteria, phagocytose bacteria. So what this looks like over here is that as the macrophages in the dish consume bacteria, the bacteria fluoresce green. So these are normal macrophages, and these are macrophages in which we've disrupted the clock by deleting that core clock gene BMAL. You can immediately see that these macrophages are much bigger and more of them are green. Here you see the macrophages quite small. So the macrophages are behaving very, very differently as we start to manipulate the clock. And sure enough, whether it's in vitro, they eat a lot more bacteria, and even in vivo, they consume more bacteria. So by disrupting the clock, we're making a big impact on how our immune system is working. So these are what this is what the macrophages look like. On the left are the sort of naturally occurring ones, and on the right are the ones in which we've perturbed, disturbed, disrupted the clock. So if we just look at them in a video format, you can see that they look really very, very different. These are flat and these are very rounded. And these have got these thick bands of interior architectural protein, which you don't see here with the clock disruptive macrophages. So we've now got a system where the clock operating in the macrophage is driving major changes in not only how they look, how fast they move, and how rapidly they can combat bacterial infection. Moreover, since we may not be able to directly affect macrophages in people, it's worth looking to see how some of the commonly used drugs we use in the clinic work and whether the time of day at which you take them makes a difference. So this is a summary of 7 old clinical trials of anti-inflammatory drugs. So some of these, for example, the prednisolone drug, is very similar to dexamethasone, which is now used to treat patients with COVID. And as you can see, in all of these 7 trials, the time of day at which they were administered made a big impact on how well they worked, indicating the necessity to consider time of dosing when we consider which drugs to use. So now just to return to our core clock machinery here, I'm just going to talk a little bit about reverb now. I have been previously talking about BMAL. So disruption of reverb just interrupts some of the outputs from the clock, and it doesn't stop the operation of the core clock itself. So why are we interested in this protein? Well, this is human chromosome 17. These are all the genes, and that's the gene that encodes reverb there. And as you can see, it's quite close to some of these blue spots, which are high up on this y-axis. And these indicate a significant genetic association, in this case with obesity, with body mass index. So reverb alpha is strongly genetically associated with human obesity, which is a very common condition. So what happens if you disrupt reverb? Well, it doesn't really make any difference to body weight, in this case in experimental mice, But if you see here, in the absence of reverb, they've got a lot more body fat. This is white adipose tissue or body fat. And if we look at the fat, you can see these are adipocytes, little fat cells. And you can see in the absence of reverb, these are all much, much larger, huge fat cells. And if we look what happens if you allow the mice to eat a sort of Western style high fat diet, they put on an enormous amount of weight in comparison to controls which haven't had the reverb disrupted. So there's human genetic evidence and there's direct experimental evidence that reverb is important for controlling obesity. So reverb is a transcription factor. It's a protein that binds to strands of DNA to regulate expression of particular genes. And here I've indicated a gene which encodes a protein in the blue. So if we want to understand what the reverb is doing, we need to see which genes it's regulating. And this has proved to be technically extremely difficult. However, we've made some recent developments which have allowed us now to directly study that. So reverb, I showed you earlier, either is present in the middle part of the day or absent later on in the day. So we're able to study, for example, at the time when reverb is present, ZT8, which is 8 hours after the lights are switched on. And each of these horizontal lines is a different location in the genome, so a gene essentially. And you can see we can find reverb binding to thousands of genes. But at ZT20, which is during the night, you can see that there are essentially no binding events at all. So this is a switch that the clock is binding to thousands of sites in the genome, in the liver, but only doing it in the daytime, not doing it at night. So what impact does that have? Well, it turns out that it's binding to genes involved in making and controlling the metabolism of fat. And as we know, reverb is important for packing on fat. It seemed like an important starting point. However, we're surprised that when reverb wasn't present just in the liver, we didn't see there was the expected increase in the pink bars of all those fat metabolizing, fat synthesizing genes. However, when we mimic what happens on occasional shift work or eating against the clock, you can see what happens now is that these pink bars really shoot up. So in the absence of that clock control of fat metabolism in the liver, eating against the clock results in a massive disturbance of how fat is handled. So if I can sort of put that in a sort of cartoon format, if we eat in time with our body clock, then the arrival of nutrients in the liver and the decision made by the liver to either use the fat for energy or to store it as stored fat is being made primarily in anticipation of the food arriving. If you eat in the middle of the night, or if you miss a meal and eat later on because you're hungry, then your liver is faced with an arrival of nutrients that it wasn't expecting. And that, we think, would cause major disturbance. However, the clock operating in the liver is able to buffer that and smooth out the irregular, the effect of irregular eating to allow us to maintain a healthy metabolism. And we think the problem with sustained night shift work is that this mechanism, which was really only evolved to cope with occasional eating against the clock, becomes overwhelmed by the pattern of abnormal eating on sustained night shift work, resulting in problems, resulting in obesity and increasing the risk of diabetes. So to summarize what I've been talking to you about, our body clock is finely tuned to help us survive in different cycles of sunshine, and it really hasn't adapted at all well to our habit now of living indoors. And the fact that we can see white light indoors doesn't mean that it's the same wavelength light that we're used to and that is effective at resetting our body clocks. Our body clocks drive our immune system and drive our inflammatory responses to both protect us against getting infections and also contributing to the expression of chronic inflammatory diseases. Our clocks are also important in energy metabolism, and in particular, they impact on how we handle fat, as fat is the key sort of storage molecule for us to survive periods of regular starvation, such as an overnight sleep, or longer periods of starvation, for example, if we can't find food. Modern living, with the prevalence of bright lights, alarm clocks, and shift work, are all a full frontal assault on our ancient and evolutionary conserved body clock. And this is why it's probably very important that we take stock of what we're doing to ourselves in order to protect ourselves from getting sick in the future. There's a widespread loss of well-being resulting from clock disruption, both in the short term with an increased risk of accidents, which can of course be catastrophic, as in the case of Chernobyl, and longer term in terms of the consequences of accumulating body fat, increasing risk of inflammatory disease and cancer. Obesity, type 2 diabetes, cancer, and asthma now have all been linked to shift work exposure. I think it's important to work with and not against our body clock, and at least to consider our body clock as an important variable in the same way that we regard nutrition as important or maintaining hydration. So I'd like to thank the members of the research group who've generated fantastically exciting research for us over the years, only some of which I've been able to show to you today. I'd like to thank my funders, the Wellcome Trust and the Medical Research Council. And I would like to thank the National Institute for Health Research for funding work in this area as we seek to try to translate our discoveries and insights into clinical benefit for both the general population and also for shift workers in particular. I'd particularly like to thank Andrew Loudon, Julie Gibbs and David Bechtold, long-standing, highly valued colleagues and friends whose insights have greatly helped me over the years. And thank you for your attention. Thank you very much.
Thank you, David. That was really interesting. We've had a couple of questions come in, which I'd like to put to you. We've got about 10 minutes for questions. One is around the role of fasting to lose weight and whether intermittent fasting actually could upset the internal body clock.
Sure. Yeah, I think it's a very good question. So undoubtedly, we're all desperately wrestling with the rising problem of obesity in developed societies. So there's a lot of emphasis on ways to reduce calorie intake and increase movement. There's some evidence that time-restricted eating, so reducing the fed period down to 8 hours or 6 hours, so that is the time when you start breakfast to the time you end your evening meal, if you compress that interval, it can be effective at aiding weight loss. There are some trials in people of that. I think that fasting itself in the short term is unlikely to impact on the clock. Your body clock will tend to follow cycles of feeding. So provided you're not fasting and then planning on eating during the night, it won't significantly impact the clock.
It might be worth just sort of explaining again the kind of how you determine which genes affect people's sleeping times. You explained how the genetics kind of affect your sleep patterns. How do you kind of drill down to identify which genes are kind of responsible for which patterns?
Sure, that's a really good question. So we've been beneficiaries, as have many colleagues, of a very large UK cohort study called the UK Biobank, maybe some people here were participants. And what this involved is individuals filling in lots of questionnaires about their lifestyle, having lots of measurements made, and also having blood taken for DNA analysis. So we have information on people's sleep patterns on about 500,000 UK residents. And we also have information about their DNA sequence. So we can look for association just doing a mathematical test between genetic variants and particular sleep patterns. And in that way, we can identify genes, some of which we already know are likely to be impacting on sleep because they are expressed or have a role in a sleep circuit in the brain. Others are quite mysterious. And we and others are very keen to understand exactly how these new genes are working.
There's a question here, which was one I was going to ask if we didn't get any questions, which was the difference between sort of early birds and night owls. And, you know, different people have, you know, automatically wake up earlier or get up later.
Yeah.
Certainly true of some teenage children, from what I know.
Yeah.
Is there any way of adjusting that pattern? And I suppose, what are the implications of those patterns on
Sure.
your...
It's a very good point. So the term is chronotype, which really just is a way of describing whether you're an early person or a late person. And you can do bird analogies. Larks are the ones who like to get up early, and owls like to get up late. So to an extent, you're genetically determined to be an early or a late person. In addition, your sex has a role, and at most ages, boys are somewhat later than girls, and your age is really important also. So you start off when you're as a young child as an extreme early chronotype. Anyone with young children knows they like to be active early in the morning. During teenage years, and particularly around the time of puberty, the chronotype is very rapidly and dramatically late shifted, and particularly so in teenage boys. And then for the rest of your life, you gradually get earlier and earlier. So we all have relatives in their 70s who don't go to work, but they still like to get up at about 7 o'clock in the morning. And this is just following your natural inclination. There are limited things you can do. So you can enforce yourself to sort of entrain or stick to a fairly rigid schedule, and that will help. But it requires effort by the individual. And there are, of course, implications for school start times and school performance of teenage boys who are half asleep in the first few lessons of the day, for example.
Somebody asked a very specific question, but it kind of, I think it's quite interesting. If a kind of, say, a middle-aged man goes to sleep at 9 o'clock every evening and wakes up at 3 o'clock every morning and has been doing that for a very long period of time, is that, does that have bad implications on their health?
Well, not especially. I mean, 6 hours sleep is probably a little shorter than most people need. The average sleep duration is thought to be between 7 and 8 hours. But if that individual wasn't tired during the day and wasn't napping during the day, if they were happy with that rhythm, then that would be, you know, perfectly acceptable. I think in general terms, the worst of all worlds is to be shifting. So if you're on rotating shifts, you seem to do worse than if you're on permanent night shifts, just because your body clock is always searching for a phase to entrain to, and it never quite gets there.
A couple of quick fire ones, probably short answers for these. If you suffer from insomnia, are LED lights a bad thing?
I think probably not. No, insomnia is a really common problem. It's something we all struggle with, but lighting probably isn't a major problem.
And this is quite an intriguing one. Do blind people have a special problem because they can't detect light in the same way in their brain?
Yes, that's a really good point. So interestingly, the vast majority of individuals who are registered as blind will still retain sufficient ocular function to entrain their central brain clock. Even if they lose image forming capability, they're still able to track day and night, which is really very, very useful, because it makes it easier if they're active when other people are active and sleeping when other people are sleeping. In individuals who are completely blind or have had their eyes kind of removed for, you know, cancer or trauma or something like that, they will be free running, so that they will sometimes be awake when other people are awake, but they'll gradually drift. So each day they'll be 30 minutes or 60 minutes later. And so every 2 or 3 weeks, they'll be exactly in antiphase to everybody else, getting up as everyone else is going to bed and be wide awake all during the night, which of course causes problems, because then these individuals may fall or suffer injuries and there's no one around to interact with in the middle of the night.
Do people who fast regularly, for example, during Ramadan, does that affect your body clock? And is it unhealthy to cram all of your eating into a kind of certain period of the day?
It's a really interesting question. I'm not aware of any studies that have really looked at that. Primarily, we follow light, but if it's for long enough, our internal body clock will tend to follow food time. I suspect that the duration of Ramadan is insufficient to cause a major realignment. But it's a really interesting question, and maybe someone should look at it.
Is there a way of measuring your own circadian rhythm?
Yeah, there are lots of ways of doing it. They range in difficulty and accuracy. So lots of apps like you know, smartphone apps, wearable electronic devices like wristwatches will give you some index of activity. We can do it more formally by bringing people into a sleep lab and measuring the rise of melatonin, which is the sleep hormone, and seeing when that happens. There are some blood tests now as well that are emerging, which will give us a measure of your phase, sort of where you're up to in your 24-hour rhythm. So it can be done, yeah.
Okay, we're kind of starting to run over time now. So I'm going to make this the last question, but I'm going to try and do 2 questions at once, which is around, you were saying about the time of day you take medication. It affects its effectiveness, if you like.
Yes.
So first of all, does that apply to all medicines? And I'll add a supplementary question, which is, have clinicians started to adopt this approach by administering those drugs at particular times of day because they're more effective then?
Sure. I'll try and answer quickly. There's a blockbuster drug called simvastatin, which lowers cholesterol, and it only works if you take it at night. Interestingly, lots of people who I see in the clinic who are taking simvastatin take it in the morning. So we've known about this since the 1950s. In most cases, drugs are not trialed with time of day in mind, and the study I showed you was a retrospective analysis of the study data, which is all publicly available, which uncovered the time of day effect. I would say that the chronotherapy, that is taking time into account when you're giving therapies, is still very much in its infancy. But I think it's clearly an interesting way of getting greater benefit from the existing list of drugs that we have. So, and it doesn't come at any particular cost either. So it would make sense to pursue this.
Great, thank you, David. I think we'll wrap up there.
Sure.
Thank you very much to everybody for attending, and apologies that we didn't get around to asking all of those questions. I hope you agree it was a really interesting talk, and thanks again for attending. I'll hand back now to Kathy.
Thank you, David and Roy, and for those amazing questions that have come through from our audience. I've certainly learned a lot today